So let me start with Dr. Francois KayitakireDirector, please. ARC is doing an incredible amount of work in the area of the early warning systems. They are the ones that sort of, brought up the flag saying, we need to have this because 60% of at least 60% of the African population do not benefit from such warning systems. And if it happens, if we have the system, this is going to protect everybody. So could you please tell us about what ARC is doing and how you perceive what can be done about those early warning systems and what needs to be done to make it work? The idea is great, the rhetoric is great. Let's get down as much as possible to the implementation and to the impediments to the implementation. Why we don't have enough of this, even though it's badly needed. We're going to save people and save resources. What needs to be done? Dr. Francois, please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Abla, Latif. And I'm glad of all the first to say good afternoon to all the attendants, and also to say that how glad I am to speak at this event along with Dr. Farouk El-Abbas. I think it's always a great pleasure for scientists talking along with I'll say more senior scientists that we have been reading the papers of, so it's always a great pleasure. Thank you for inviting me along together with Dr. Farouk El-Abbas. Going direct to the point where I would like first to say a few words about African risk capacity, because I'm assuming that many in the audience may not know that agency. Let me see if I will be able to share my screen, because sometimes the technologies will not. Now I'm going back to Zoom and share my screen.
Yep.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So the African Risk Capacity is a specialized agency of the African Union. It was established in 2012, and the main objective was actually to help member states to respond quickly to natural disasters. So meaning that the response, and we are focusing mainly to climate-related natural disaster, but we have also a component looking at the epidemics and the outbreaks that became very relevant in the aftermath of the COVID-19 crisis. When the mechanism was established in 2012, the member states want to actually to have two components. One is indeed all running as we are speaking now. The second one was also to have a predictable financing mechanism so that the countries can have access to funds and be able to respond quickly. One approach that was adopted to have this access to funds quickly is an insurance mechanism. That insurance is taken by the countries, so what we call sovereign insurance, and is based on a pre-agreed index and also threshold above which the insurance will pay out. So which means that for having this index properly calibrated, we need very detailed modeling so that we everyone can have confidence in the fact that the modeling will reflect correctly the ground, the situation, and allow to intervene earlier. Currently, African Risk Capacity has 35 member states. When I say 35 member states, it's because although the target is the whole continent, all the 53 or 55 member states of the African Union, the agency was established also as based on the treaty. So the countries, to be able to join the mechanism, must sign the treaty. So we have 35 countries that have signed the treaty. You see on the map those countries. Most of them are from the Sahel belt and also in Southern Africa. We are still also approaching countries in Northern Africa and also in the West Africa Southern Africa to to be able to continue to grow in terms of participating member states. This trying to get the next slide. Okay, it's always challenge. Let me go back to.
That's okay. No worries. Take your time.
All right. So the service that we provide to countries are actually in three areas. One is about error warning that we deliver through our own platform, which is called Africa Risk View. That is a mechanism that we have developed since 2012, and now is providing error warning information on drought risk, but also on tropical cyclone risk. And in the coming month, we'll integrate also warnings about the flood risk issue. When those, that is the element that most of the countries are using. When the countries join the ARC mechanism, they have access to that system, and then calibrate the models that we use in the system. And then when the countries are happy with the modeling and the warning systems, they prepare also the contingency planning. We support countries to prepare the contingency planning. What does it? Is that they have to have a plan in advance, how you will intervene if there is a natural disaster. If there is a drought, what kind of intervention are you going to put in place, and how we are going to deliver the aid to affected people? This is very important to have this planning done ahead, so that when there is a payout, there is a fund made available to the government, there is no delays in assisting people. We have actually observed that sometimes when the error warning mechanism has worked, sometimes there is a delays in intervention, not only because of lack of funds, but sometimes because of lack of planning in terms of what kind of intervention we are going to do. And the third component, of course, is about accessing finance. That is the critical element, because you know that most of the countries that we are serving don't have the budgetary freedom to put aside some amount for intervention when there is a disaster. So sometimes, very often, is when there is a disaster, the countries have to go through what they call the humanitarian calls, and they have to go through a lengthy process that makes actually the intervention coming quite late. So the purpose was to make sure that based on the parametric insurance, based on the parameters that are agreed upon in advance, where then you can make liquidity available to countries very quickly. Of course, there is still a challenge about that, is that also although our mechanism is working, but the level of delivery, the level of amount and the volume of transactions is still low compared to the needs of the countries that you are serving. But it is another component, and perhaps that I think you have probably addressed when you talk about the climate risk financing. Regarding the error warning, how our mechanism works. So we have a very effective model that actually look at the risk of drought and the number of people affected. Most of the error warning systems that you will find actually now in operations will stop on the level of detecting, of having indices to say that is a drought or not, and sometimes trying to quantify the severity of the drought, but really they go up to modeling the impact of that drought on people. So within African risk capacity, we go up to modeling the impact of that drought on people. So the focus we are taking is about food security. So is it the impact on food security of people? So we try to understand how many people are at risk of falling into food insecurity because of that drought. Once we have this number of people, then the government can decide which intervention to do, and then we link to that also a response cost. How much is going to cost to support the people who are affected. And that is this response cost usually that is also used for insurance underwriting for taking insurance. So the premium will depend on how much the government wants to insure for the response cost. This mechanism has been now I'll say working for around now. This is the first mechanism, the first time that the risk pool was really I would say set up. It was 2014. So we have now had up 8 pools. Now we're 9 pools. So when I say pool, it's about the number of seasons during which we have had countries underwriting the insurance to respond to drought risk. In the meantime, we have also added an insurance against tropical cyclone, working almost in the same mechanism, except that for tropical cyclone, it's a very short interventions, because you see the event developing, you see this tropical cyclone developing, and then you have also to inform the country so that sometimes they have also to have preparatory measures to mitigate the impact. But the insurance mechanism is still about the response cost for error interventions. That's how we do this in African at African Risk Capacity. And then there was a discussion about what actually is working in Africa and what should do to continue to support countries. When it comes to error warning, I would say that we have a number of mechanisms that are working quite well, although the problem is that always to have this capacity internalized within the country. Because at the end of the day, the interventions will be more successful if they are done by the government itself. This, I think, is a principle that does not change. The government can have support from outside. We can support the government, but we will not build sustainable systems if the systems are not internalized, are not really adopted by the countries, and the countries can run the system themselves. What we have noticed that when we have very good how say human resources, capacities in the countries, but there is a competition in terms of the capacities for the government, because very often government officials are overwhelmed with many tasks, and sometimes they don't have enough resources to continue to adopt and to internalize the system themselves. I think that is an area where there is need to support the government, to support officials in the government, to really run the system themselves. When we discuss these issues, sometimes people will say it's about the government to pay themselves for those services. Yeah, it's a fair point indeed, but at the same time, we see also support coming from donors or other financial partners, supporting international organizations to do the same work that the governments are supposed to do. I think this is something that we should address, to support the capacity of the government instead of continuing to do the work that the governments are doing. So within African Risk Capacity, what we do is what I have shown. Most of the work in terms of customizing the model is done by what we call the technical working groups within the country, which is made up by experts who are within the country. So which means that actually we are supporting them in setting up the mechanism. Then for the monitoring, they do it themselves using our systems. That's true, but it's also the system, because at the end of the day, when we do calibration and they have make access, they do give access to them, to the models, it becomes the system. But I think we can do better. We can do better to have them really owning the systems themselves. Dr. Farouk El-Abbas mentioned the issue of having African-owned satellites to continue to observe what's happening on the continent. I think this is a very important point, because for now, many countries around the world, I think it's not only African countries, relies on data collected by satellites managed by big say special space agencies like NASA or the European Space Agency. So there are still, those data is available for free, but sometimes they are not tailored to the needs of the countries. Also, no one knows what will happen in the future if there will be no need actually to have its own satellite. Because when you look at the communication issue in the telecommunication domain, sometimes it's important to have your own satellite. So it can be also useful to have African owned capacities for that. When it comes to satellite with higher spatial resolution, which are more precise in terms of observing the Earth, then things change completely, because in that case, data becomes, they are not anymore freely available. You have to pay for the data. And that is can be a big challenge when you want to have more precise information for early warning, because you have then to pay for this data, and it can be very expensive. So now we can be talking about investing in the capacity to have our own satellite. And someone can say, how are you going to put money building satellites when people are dying of famine in Somalia or South Sudan? That is always a big challenge. I'm saying this because myself, I have been working on different areas of remote sensing, including monitoring drought for food security, or assessing food insecurity in countries. When you do food security assessment in the field, sometimes you wonder what I'm going to do with the satellite image. But when you are at the making decision level, when you have to decide on a resource allocation, you realize actually that you need that information, and that information will actually support people, will help people, that actually it's worth investing in those resources to be able to support and save those people who are actually suffering. It's not a luxury. I think it's something that actually African countries can think about. If they put together resources, I think it can be done. There will have been attempts, if Nigeria having their own satellites. I think some other countries have followed with some satellites, but very often there was a challenge with what we call the ground segment. The ground segment are actually the part of processing data coming from the satellite and then make it available to the users, like you see on Google Earth or on Google Maps. To make this data available, that is this ground segment which is missing. Sometimes we have a satellite flying there, sending data, but the ground segments sometimes are weaker. The other thing is in terms of when we're talking about natural disasters related to climate, is in terms of with getting information about those weather events, being rainfall, forecast of tropical cyclones, forecast of flooding. Those are areas that need, I think, strong expertise and the capacities that are, shall say, scarce on the continent. And the resources available on the continent are put into, Africa is in competition with other bigger organizations, say other employers who sometimes actually will provide better conditions than African employers. Then you see this flight of brains about these areas. And how to do that? I think it's to invest in education. I think the third level education, university education. I think it's very important to invest in that area so that the student at the university will really start to invest in those areas also can do a difference. So I will be stopping here. Perhaps it will be easier for other things I'll explain through questions and answers so that I don't get you sleeping now in the afternoon. Thank you very much, Dr. Abla. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Francois. Thank you for a very rich presentation, and you did raise a lot of very important issues. The issue about having you are doing a great job, okay, with this, but then you mentioned some key points like that the intervention are best if done by the governments themselves, okay? And the governments are not internalizing the system. And the question is why? and yet they are willing to put money, or they accept money from the international organizations to do jobs that can be done by African organizations that do the same. And why do the international organizations do the work instead of providing capacity building for the governments to do the work themselves? These are actually key issues. And I think it's essential here that we ask the international organizations as a key recommendation to invest in the capacities of governments to be able to do those programs using the existing African expertise. I think this is actually extremely important. Okay. You also mentioned something about the government. A small question to you before I move to Dr. Elbaz to comment on what you said on satellites. But before that, let me ask you a question. You are doing the work, you are giving the warning, you told the government that this is going to happen. Do they actually act? And it's nice and great to have a warning, but do they act? Do they act? Or people still end up dying and nothing happens? This is really very critical, because government is not only about having the program and reaching the results, it's about having a whole chain of actions, all of them connected, taken from the point where you know when the problem is going to take place, how much is its impact going to be. Then comes the preparation. What is the readiness of African governments to do this preparation? The question is for you, Dr. Francois.
Okay, so what we have observed with...
Yes, I had to bring you back. I mean, you cannot relax and wait for the other speaker. You had to be grabbed back. So go ahead. Sorry.
Okay, no problem. I think that what we have observed with African risk capacity mechanism is that at the beginning, indeed, you realize that most of the government have not streamlined the mechanism, how they're going to respond to a disaster. Sometimes there are policies in terms of disaster risk management. Sometimes there are laws, and there are institutions like the services are there, but sometimes it's not well streamlined, and sometimes they don't really plan for that because they consider that if there is anything that people will find a way somehow. And then the mechanism of ARC, what is good for it is that because we do first the analysis of the risk profile of the country by modeling and making people understand the risk they're facing. And second is about what we call this contingency planning. Actually brings also it's time also to the government to reflect on how they're going to respond. We have seen that there is a gradual improvement in terms of response when countries are participating regularly in the African risk mechanism. That's done. And then there is about also sustainability of that mechanism, because it happens so that from the countries, the capacity is built, people are there, they start working, and for any reason for changing the government, things change again and disappear. And then we have to restart. So that's I think the most here, it's important to have all the mechanisms streamlined within the administration, the governmental processes, and to make aware most of the officials in the government about the importance of having those processes clearly outlined, so that when there is disaster, there is a mechanism to respond. Sometimes there is a tendency to say, why should I plan if I don't expect to get any resources to respond? Because also when you do humanitarian call, resources may come with conditions that may actually delay your plan. So that's important to have a mechanism like ARC where you have everything agreed upon beforehand, and then you also slowly build the capacity of the government. And also, as I said, again, I'm going to repeat it, this should be done by the government. So we should support the government to do that instead of doing it on behalf of the government.
Thank you very much. You know that we made a bunch of scary statements, huh? People will find their way somehow. Why should we prepare when we're not going to have funds? Hey, let God deal with them and take care of their problems. These are very, very, very scary. Another question for you before I move to Dr. Farouk again. Which governments which African government did you find most responsive from your experience so far at ARC in having those systems? You do those systems, the early warning systems, and you're working with governments. Which one did you find most responsive? Is that a political question? It's a political question. Just give me the region. Just point to the map that we had earlier. Region, part of Africa, east, west, north, south, something like that. Without putting you in the corner, okay? I'll let you think about it. Okay, I'm gonna be fair. I'll let you think about it. But I will move to Dr. Farouk and ask him, you mentioned the idea of the satellite, which is really very critical in being able to have the early warning systems and investing in the satellite. And then Dr. Francois said very clearly that there are problems at every level with the satellites. Governments do not want to put money in there. It says, I have all those hungry people. How do I put money in satellite? Okay, but so I mean, the satellite is not to watch soccer movies, soccer matches live, okay? But they are there actually to warn people from dying, so you provide less dying. So what do you say to that? And what do you say to the fact that there are actually technical problems? It's very expensive, and that's a challenge. And that there are also technical problems with the, if understood correctly, okay, with the information coming from the satellite that is not tailor-made to the needs of Africa. What do you say to that, Dr. Farouk?
First of all, the satellite is not a very expensive affair. Egypt had itself paid for a satellite made in Ukraine, that's okay, but paid for it in full. And it had an agency to do all of the data analysis from it. So the first answer is that satellites are not that expensive. They have been getting down in costs considerably, and now it is something like $20 million can have can make a space agency for you, not just a satellite. So satellites themselves are not expensive. Egypt bought one. Other countries have bought several. And the facility for interpreting satellite images exists throughout the world. In Africa, there are very good scientists who can interpret satellite images. In South Africa, in Ghana, there are some. In all of the Arab countries, there are many. So when we can put an agency and put in it the best possible people, wherever they come from, it doesn't matter. But they can interpret the images for all of Africa and supply the satellite images with the results of that to all the people that need it to be. I mean, you make it an African event. You will have one satellite to go all around the world in polar orbit so that it can see all of Africa at the same scale, and have a group of people from the best possible group in Africa to do the analysis and provide it throughout the country for free. You can take a sheet from India's book. India created several satellites. The latest satellite right now is a satellite that goes all over near polar, goes all over India, and looks specifically for vegetation, for food production. Every farmer in India can communicate with the satellite directly from his own phone to request a photograph at a certain time of the month of his piece of land to see whether it needs more water or needs more everything. Each and every farmer with an iPhone can communicate with the Indian satellite, meaning it's not a huge operation. It's not going to the moon or to Mars. It is something that is very simple. Everybody knows now that pictures from space can tell you where vegetation is and what is the health of the vegetation, or where sandstorms are and what is being done to the land. It's no big deal. You can teach that in the geography classes in high school, not even universities. You can teach this, how to interpret pictures in high school geography classes throughout the continent. It's no big deal now. It is very easy. It's a matter of concentrating your effort and making certain that the proper data gets to the right people, the ones that need it most. For instance, the food producing people, or the government employees that need to make a canal or whatever it is. So it is number one, it's no longer that expensive. Number two, we have experts in Africa, and if we don't have them, we can train African people to do the job. There's no question.
Dr. Farouk, please.
Well,
Yes.
I just saw that, I didn't know. So it is
It's okay.
a summary of what I said is that it really is not expensive. Egypt had satellite by itself, bought a satellite that died, but that's fine. And whole of African nations can put through the African Union can buy several satellites, not just one, but we need one to fly in polar orbit and provide the data for everyone to use. And we have agencies within Africa today that can receive this satellite data and actually interpret it and actually give it to farmers and so on. I just mentioned an example, I don't know whether you get it or not, of India, where Indian farmers individually can communicate with the satellite through their own iPhone, communicate directly with the Indian satellite to request photographs of their territory so that they can see whether their plants require feeding or require irrigation. Individual farmers can communicate with the Indian satellite to get data of their plots. So we're not asking to do that, but we're asking to provide the data for at least the countries, all of the countries, and the technical people in all the countries, to provide the necessary data for all the people to deal with all natural disasters, all changes on Earth, whatever is happening, including food production, amount of rain, concentration of water from rainfall, whatever it is. It is something that is very easy to see from space, and it's something that we can spread very easily from centers with a few technical people that can do it. It's no longer going to the moon. It's a very simple operation now.
Thank you very much, Dr. Farouk.